Hello, my name is Stephen Norris, and I am the Walter E. Havighurst Professor of Russian History and Director of the Havighurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies at Miami University. The Havighurst Center turns 20 years old this academic year, and the first conference we convened was held in Oxford, Ohio in March 2001 on the theme of imagining Russia. A number of prominent scholars came to campus to talk about the state of the field being broadly imagined and inclusive in that first ever conference. And we thought we'd use our 20th anniversary in 2020 and 2021 to reimagine what we know through a series of YouTube conversations. Today's guests are Bruce Grant and Naomi Caffee, and we're going to talk about the Caucasus, about satire in the region, and about our understanding of regions once within the Russian and Soviet empires, areas both Bruce and Naomi study. First, before we get to those subjects, let me introduce my guests. Bruce Grant is professor and chair of anthropology at New York University. A specialist on the cultural politics in the former Soviet Union, he's done field work in both Siberia and the Caucasus. He's the author of the award-winning book In the Soviet House of Culture, A Century of Perestroikas, which is a study of the Sovietization of an indigenous people on the Russian Pacific coast, as well as author of The Captive and the Gift, Cultural Histories of Sovereignty in Russia and the Caucasus, on the making of the Caucasus in the Russian popular imagination. His current research explores the early 20th century pan-Caucasus journal Mala Nasreddin, which existed from 1905 to 1931, as an idiom for rethinking contemporary Eurasian space and authoritarian rule within it. Our other guest is Naomi Caffee, who's assistant professor of Russian at Reed College. Her research concerns minority and transnational writing in Russian, with a particular focus on authors from Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Siberia. Her work is taking her to Azerbaijan, Abkhazia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and the Russian Arctic. Her publications include articles on Russian literature and the life and legend of Abai, a Kazakh poet, and most recently on Olja Suleimanov, a Kazakh Soviet Russian language poet. Her current book project is entitled Russophonia, Writing the Wide Russian World. Naomi was also one of the lead scholars that worked to create the digital archive of Oskar Schmerling, a caricaturist who worked in the Caucasus and published in the same journal that Bruce is researching. I'm pleased both of you could join us. Thank you very much. And let me begin by starting broadly and just ask you both about how you came to be interested in Soviet peripheries in general. Bruce, thinking about your work dating back to In the Soviet House of Culture, and Naomi, your articles on Abai, on Awezov, on Suleimanov, the Kazakh poets. So Bruce, why don't you tell us a little bit of how you got to be interested in these regions?
Please. Steve, you're very kind, and it's great not just to join the both of you, but I hope an audience to bring us all back to the Havighurst Center one day, which is a place I've been really grateful to be able to visit on a number of times with lots of great conversations. The question of peripheries, I think, is so interesting because, on the one hand, of course, in a common sense way, we're amplifying an empirical record that had obviously been relatively out of bounds during the restrictions of the Cold War. That certainly goes without saying, and those new empirical records go a long way to challenge, of course, existing tenets and canons. And I think we could all think of a variety of ways of that, of how that has been performed in the last 30 years since the Soviet Union has come to an end. I think the thing, if I had one simple phrase, the one that I like to have rehearsed the most often, is that I still, for all of the emphasis on power and politics, which have been the subject of most of my own research, how political forms have morphed across time and space and how the Soviet experience has changed over time and space. It's nonetheless the case for me that I always want any reader and any of us as scholars to think of a world with no peripheries where everything is a center, right? And that's not to be clever in a sense to deny power in any way, but if we appreciate that people's lives are central unto themselves, right? Then we're looking at a rather different set of questions. When I started working on the world of Soviet indigenous people many years ago on Sakhalin Island, north of Japan, it was, of course, already in the empirical sense, already striking for me, having spent a year and a half in Moscow, sitting talking to people that I was ready to meet rebels, indigenous rebels who would be angry at the Soviet cause because of all the rather obviously dramatic historical events that had taken place. This group of people with whom I worked, 1/3 of all men had been killed in a single year during the purges. And so I was ready to meet a lot of angry people from the prison house of nations, right? And that didn't really turn out to be the case. But it was not just the fact that that helped to revise certain kinds of canons about nationality policy at the time, perhaps. It's more that what struck me and what really informed when I wanted to go move into the Caucasus some 10 years later is that we refuse this presumption of periphery and start to think about how and why people's lives are central unto themselves, then we start asking a completely different set of questions. And sometimes that can lead to a certain kind of a language fetishism, to be sure. My own work in the Russian Far East would have been very different if I knew Japanese or Chinese, and I just finished working with a terrific student who wrote a great dissertation on Vladivostok at the center of the Russian-Chinese encounter. Having many languages would help me in the Caucasus, as Naomi will know well. But the point is that it reminds us not simply just of the vastness of the former Russian Empire and the former Soviet Union, but it really presses all of us to think about the kinds of presumptions that we start with and how we can start to undo them. So that's off the top of my head, but Naomi will surely give a better answer.
Oh, yeah. Well, I actually agree with you about this notion of centering peripheries and also the notion of upending expectations about Russia and the Russian-speaking world. I can say probably the whole history of my personal engagement with the Russian-speaking world has been a series of upended expectations. I started studying Russian in the year 2000 at the Liberal Arts College and had this pretty standard and also very narrow notion of what Russian culture was and what the Russian world was. So I learned about Pushkin and Moscow and St. Petersburg and onion domes. And then when I actually went to Russia to study abroad, I realized, oh my gosh, there's this entire extremely diverse world that I only knew a small sliver about from my previous study of the Russian language and Russian cultures. And so ever since then, I think my engagement with the literature that's coming out of this world has been to really showcase that diversity and to show all the different kinds of interactions between Russian and non-Russian cultures, and how what we think about as Russian culture and Russianness is not something that's fixed and compartmentalized and static throughout time. And so what I like to focus on in my work is this negotiation of Russianness and the way that people incorporate all kinds of different things from the Russian literary tradition and aspects of Russian culture in the expression of and depiction of non-Russian realities. So some of my work has focused on the incorporation of the legend and works of Alexander Pushkin in the Kazakh tradition. I'm interested in how Russophone Kazakh writers like Aljas Suleimenov wrote in the Russian language in order to put forward this really radical notion of decolonization in the 1950s and 60s, and kind of were upheld as poster children of Soviet-led liberation and positioned at the forefront of what was then known as the Second and Third Worlds. And so this also kind of this continuous upending of expectations and this revealing of complexities, where before I thought there were none, has been like the consistent thread in everything that I've researched so far. And that includes this current project that I have about caricature in the South Caucasus in the early 20th century.
We'll talk about that in a second, but I'm really struck by the fact that both of you answered the question and kind of referenced your encounters in the region and how that sort of upended expectations, as you said, Naomi. Reminded me while you were talking that I spent the summer of 1997 studying Russian in Kazan. And of course, I knew a little bit about Kazan and its significance as both a Tatar and Russian center of culture. But it was only in going to Kazan and seeing what it was like and seeing the return of Islam in Kazan and then eating Tatar food and talking to people there about how they tried to practice Islam, but, during the Soviet period, didn't always involve abstaining from alcohol, for example. So I'm curious if there's a moment like that, like some encounter that you have that really stands out from your work that also helps us understand how the peripheries matter, or how we have to rethink what we think we know about the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, or something like that. Maybe this time Naomi can start.
Let's see. Well, I think I also probably had some experiences like what you're describing, probably to do with Tatar culture. I seem to think that I did meet people who were from Kazan and who were Tatar and, practiced Islam and had a real moment of cognitive dissonance. Like, wait, what country am I in after all? So certainly I had this kind of personal experience with it. As far as literary studies, I'd have to think about that, because I think my discovery of Soviet multinational writers like Chingiz Aitmatov and Alshaz Suleimanov was the first kind of formal research-based way that I started engaging with Russia's diversity. And I'm continuously surprised also how that I guess informs my understanding of canonical Russian literature. So at Reed, I teach classes on Russian realism and the 19th century Russian novel. And when I return to those works kind of with this experience of investigating Russia's diversity, all of this internal diversity within the Russian canon and within the lives of canonical writers also starts to jump out at me. And that's something that I'm able to also point out to my students, and that's made for some really fruitful conversations in class.
I can follow on that front just by saying that I think, I like what Naomi's saying here, because it reminds us of the self-consciousness that people have of this play between the center and periphery that is, I can't speak to a great moment when, of course we've all been in the room when someone will say, will praise Allah and then want to drink, with a toast and so forth. That's a classic moment and a very post-Soviet one. I think the thing that I was struck by the most is that, for example, even thinking back to the time in the Russian Far East, it was the kind of patience that what taught me, the people themselves taught me with the kind of patience that they demonstrated by waiting for me to sort out that I could get past some of the stereotypes. And so Steve, to answer your question, the most classic thing that I smiled at when you gave that example is that I spent most of my time on Sakhalin Island having various men and women from this indigenous group kind of joke with me that I was somehow, I still assume that therefore because they got older, they must now be elders. And because they get older, they must now be wise. And because they're indigenous, they must, well, Bruce, because we're indigenous, we have this wonderful relationship to the environment. We would never litter, and then they'd throw something up in the air and laugh. And the point was, they were waiting for me to figure out that they know, I knew, but though it took me longer than them, to appreciate that they had already been folded into someone else's stories. And they were waiting for me to kind of break out of that pattern. And that's why I think the kind of work that Naomi is doing is really super important, right? And not just to broaden our canon and diversify it for all the reasons that we know are important. And it's also just to undo the very assumptions that we have about regional knowledge in the first place, right? And so I was given a very classic schooling on what it would take for me to accept people just as people rather than putting them as indigenous people first or what have you. And that goes back to our center and periphery moment, right? It's great to tell other stories of Russian worlds, but it also is really incumbent upon us to find ways to write about other people the way we would want to be written about ourselves. And that's still to this day, I think that's one of the hardest things to be able to do.
That's a perfect segue, Bruce. Thanks. Because, in some ways, what a perfect source to thinking about the diversity of the Russian Empire and the early Soviet Empire, as well as the up-in stories and tell stories from different points of view than the work you're both doing right now, which is quite interesting. So, Bruce, maybe tell us a little bit about this journal and how you're approaching it, and then we'll ask Naomi to introduce her caricatures, because, of course, it's her caricatures.
Please. Naomi is the mistress of illustration to a day because she's working on a super famous illustrator. I'm just so grateful. I've been learning more about her teamwork and the work that she's doing with her group. But I love telling people for a variety of reasons about a project that I've been doing on and off for the past almost 10 years now, which is the story of a journal that was published first out of Tbilisi, then briefly out of northern Iran, and then out of Azerbaijan, called Mullah Nasr-ad-Din, taking off the very likely true life figure of the wise man trickster on the Anatolian plateau of many centuries back. He became a mullah in the Persian Khan text, and it was a group of intellectuals in the Caucasus who brought this person to life in the form of this journal, which ran from 1905 to 1931. It's not hard to do the math, but especially with an audience of area studies people, to realize just what an extraordinary time it would be for a journal like that to last 25 years, when so many other publications of the same times and places, but especially across the whole former empire, at least up until 1917, were just folding left and right. The press freedoms of 1905 had obviously opened things up a fair bit, but it didn't mean that there was staying power, right? So this journal lived through imperial censorship. It lived through the Russian Revolution. It lived through World War I. It lived through the rise of Stalinism, and of course, eventually ended as Stalin at the very moment when Stalin started to cement his power. It was super smart. It was very funny. It's lavishly illustrated, as we will see perhaps in a few moments. But the reason I like to draw attention to this is there's so many of them. But for starters, of course, it's just a simple and extremely accessible way for people to think of the Caucasus otherwise. To think of this world area, which is known primarily through its trajectories, its historical records of violence, through folklore, through archaeology, through comparative linguistics. These are the very polished chestnuts by which area studies has affectionately kind of boxed off the Caucasus and said, you can go think of it in that respect. And to take something like this, which is on the one hand an artifact of what one might think of as high culture, to start to open the gates to the incredible writers and so forth who are part of this world, is all great, right? But beyond those fairly self-evident virtues, I think there's also something I always want to draw attention for people to, the very genre of satire itself, right? Which then gets back to this notion of centers and peripheries. The notion of satire, if we go back to the original Greek, just simply meant a buffet, right? An assortment of food, a mishmash of this and this and this and this, a smorgasbord of a certain kind. And well, many of us want to think of it as a kind of and I put this on my very profile that Steve, you cited earlier, right? That of course it can be an index of authoritarian rule and a rich illustration, and I absolutely am compelled by that. But at the same time, the genre of satire itself already starts to oblige us to ask how we start to come to know certain worlds in the first place. What was extraordinary about this 8 pages of text that came in this broadsheet. Sorry, I should say this 8-page broadsheet that came with 4 pages of text normally and 4 pages of illustrations, somewhat sprinkled across, is that they would have these sightings from the most out of the way rural areas, the most expected things from the capitals, the most unusual things from various world events, and not in a particularly clever or special way that was trying to be dazzling or that drew any attention to itself. But in fact, it did reflect in a really quite great way the ways in which most men and women of these times and places were drawing together different pieces of information about the world around them. And in that respect, satire itself becomes kind of an idiom of pluralism for the Caucasus already. It's not something the Caucasus is always known for. We know it has lots of languages and religions and social spaces, but if it's known to most of our colleagues, it's through the Chechen wars, perhaps any number of other military battles, which tend to be a kind of a let's stand off, right? Let's keep our distance. That already leaves out the fascinating question of the Chechens that no one ever talks about, which is that they are among the very few people on the planet who simply follow Nancy Reagan and the war on drugs, right? They looked at colonialism and they just said no. Sorry, we're not buying it. We're not buying any of it. And even if you defeat us in a military moment, you might have won the battle, but we're not giving in to this war. We're just saying no, right? That's an idiom of sovereignty, which is fascinating and for which Chechens and Ingush and so forth have rarely been given credit. But I just want to maybe just say, maybe close up by just saying that I think that the great thing about satire, more than just being entertaining and in this case, beautifully illustrated and well written, it always is great to see someone give the finger to the man, right? And send up princes and potentates, and in this case also many corrupt figures from the religious world and so forth. It's always a pleasure to see someone taken off their pedestal, perhaps. But here, it's satire itself as a genre becomes an idiom not only for pluralism, but in so much of my own thinking about sovereignty in this world area, kind of a form of open sovereignty rather than a kind of a sense of closure, is that this satire was a profound sense of engagement of other people's, right? We often misunderstand it as something which is just purely to ridicule or just laugh at rather than with. And this was very much laughing with, right? This was absolutely a form of engagement, at least in most instances, I would make the case. So as kind of thinking about pluralism in this world area, thinking about a different kind of a sovereignty and engagement, you won't find anything smarter and better illustrated. So that's a long answer to a short question. And would you look at the time?
It's a great answer. And maybe
something tells me.
I don't think anyone embodies this pluralism better than Oscar Schmerling, this cartoonist who worked for this. I mean, he sort of upends the way we might expect satire to work in this journal. So Naomi, why don't you introduce us to him and show us some of his work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll see if this is going to work. There we go. All right. Is that visible?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah. So where to start? So I guess we'll start with the middle image, which is from Mullah Nasreddin. That's the journal that Bruce was telling us about. And this was my entry point to the work of Oscar Schmerling. When I was in graduate school, I was fortunate enough to study Azeri together with some colleagues, and we absolutely loved reading Mullah Nasreddin. We used it to study, and at the time, it didn't occur to us to think much about the visual component of this journal. We were approaching it from a really logocentric perspective, and one thing that we did eventually notice was that a lot of the caricatures had this very distinctive signature at the bottom. And much later, my colleague from grad school, Robert Dennis, who's now at the Baku Research Institute and is a member of this team that I'm working with to digitize the works of Schmerling, noticed that this signature appeared in other journals from the South Caucasus at this time as well. And we were, again, our expectations or our assumptions about the press at this time and place and how the earliest, articulations of nascent national identity were coming about, also started to be upended. We realized it's all the same guy that's creating these iconic images that are identified with these emerging nationalist movements, especially in the Georgian, Azeri, and Armenian cases. And so we decided that we were going to look into this person, and we found just a wealth of just this entire very multicultural body of work. And this is how the project was born, basically. So together with colleagues from the Tbilisi State Academy of Art, we created this archive. And more than anything, what we wanted to do was showcase Oscar Schmeling's work in this multicultural context. And I'm so glad, I was so grateful to hear your really insightful comments, Bruce, about pluralism, because what we see with this cross-section of works that are all done by Schmeling is not only pluralism on the level of the print of the literary content of a journal like Mullah Nasruddin, but also the pluralism of the voices from different communities in the South Caucasus that are all working in the same milieu to produce these different satirical journals, the different ways that reading audiences would have been able to engage with these satirical messages. So the visual content is making the printed content or some of the printed the messages from the print content accessible to audiences who might not be literate. There's also an interaction between the printed material and the visual material. So, for example, here we see writing within the caricature, and we see captions that are all working together to produce a message that can be interpreted in different ways and with different types of information standing out to us. And so this is what we think is one of the kind of the greatest potential of a project like this, is that it's making these kinds of readings possible of the satirical press in the South Caucasus. And I also have just, so this is the URL of the site. The archive is called Beyond Caricature. And for now, the content is in English, but we are planning to make the content available in other languages of the South Caucasus as well, so that researchers there will be able to use it and learn more about this tradition. And the other thing that I'll say is that when we look at the caricatures themselves, we see a very similar kind of thematics emerging in the journals across Georgian, Azeri, Armenian journals. So, for example, these two caricatures from Mullah Nasruddin and a Georgian journal called Eshmakis Matrahi, the Devil's Whip, are commenting about efforts at new method, Jadid schooling, and then Georgian mother tongue education, kind of lampooning the shortfalls of these progressive efforts. We also see a critical eye cast on religious practice and institutions of religion. And this caricature on the right, which is from the same journal, the Devil's Whip, the Georgian journal, is also interesting for the pluralism of different alphabets and different titles of other journals that are referred to. So this is a caricature featuring these guys are representing different journals, and we have an Armenian one, we have a Russian one, we have an Azeri language one. So that also highlights, I think, translinguistic types of interactions that were happening at this time and place. And of course, the fact that Schmeling is an ethnic German, not from a German-speaking country, but a local Tbilisi based ethnic German, a quintessential product of empire, is all the more interesting and invites all the more investigation into these kinds of connections. So I'll just end there, and I guess a final point that I can bring up with these next images is that the press itself is also an object of satire. And so the self-referential aspect is also something that comes out when we look at Schmeling's caricatures from across these different periodicals.
Thank you. Yeah, this glimpse even is an extraordinary look into how
great.
pluralism works, doesn't it? I mean, the image, and what's interesting too is how the image really is the center here, because that's something everyone could at least grasp. And then the multiple languages that have to be overlaid for anyone reading it to understand a little more, as well as you mentioned, Naomi, the fact that Schmeling himself is a perfect product of this multicultural, very diverse empire. And the source itself is so rich, as Bruce said, because of Well, a number of reasons. I mean, where it was published, how long it survived, and not just how long it survived, but the years it survived. So, we've used these conversations at the Havighurst Center to kind of take stock on interesting work, like the kind you've both just talked about, but also interesting work in our field, again, broadly imagined. So, a couple minutes left, perhaps, maybe, especially because Bruce did so much in the 2000s in editing this seminal series, Culture and Society After Socialism, to really further the work in our field. And Naomi, your own work is at the forefront of the way now the field is turning toward transnational and global elements of what it is we study. So maybe a couple recommendations of things that are exciting you now in the field. Again, starting with Bruce.
I am still in a Caucasus mode, so maybe this is parochial in some respects, but I always want to give a shout out, not least because I'm still thinking of these great images that Naomi just shared. I always want to give a shout out to the fantastic art collective Slavs and Tatars. For anyone who hasn't spent any time on their site, they are the best of what Molanas Radin might do today, which is they're smart, they're funny, and they're making widely available a series of kind of art interventions about contemporary geopolitics in this world area, and that they're some of my favorite colleagues. When only maybe with a captive audience here on a screen, it might seem a bit counterintuitive to want to plunge back to a very distant past, but when I want to bring up the Caucasus with people, I always tell them to start with the books of the great archaeologist, now Cornell Adam Smith, not the political economist, but the author of a terrific first book was on the political landscape. The second book, I think, was called The Political Machine. But either way, he works through the idioms of Eurasian archaeology to cast struggles in a world area and social formations in a world area that are really destabilizing, because you're not used to thinking of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, et cetera, without the convenient categories and containers and labels that make life easier for all of us to kind of bring to the table what we think we already know. And I think the reason I love those books so much and talk about them, as I did again just this week with someone, is they put you in just the right frame of mind, whether it's for the Caucasus or thinking about any imperial formation, of kind of undoing what you think you're going to learn. And so there's a great favorite. And maybe in a third vein, most recently, I took part in a great workshop on a book that literally just came out a few weeks ago by the young historian Krista Goff, who has a great book called Nested Nationalisms, which does something, again, quite unexpected. We've all read books about, the significant nationalist movements of the Republican forces, the Kazakhs, the Ukrainians, et cetera. But what this book does is actually look at the doubling and the trebling of Soviet nationality policies by looking at how minorities within republics fared. The story is absolutely fascinating. There's so many twists and turns that you wouldn't expect. In some respects, of course, it's just a straightforward competition for resources, but it's done through the lens of this socialist set of affiliations. It's a terrific book and really a game-changing book for thinking about political units in the Caucasus, I think. And I'll leave it at that, but those are some favorites.
Yeah. I guess, there are a few interesting pivots that I see going on in literary studies of the Caucasus and also the other regions that I study, Central Asia and Siberia, the Russian far north. The one that excites me the most, I guess, is what seems to be a pivot towards looking at the texts themselves and understanding the texts on their own terms and in their own right as objects that are valid of inquiry. Worthy of inquiry. And what I mean by that is, I think at the time that I started studying, for example, Soviet multinational literature, one common approach that I would see is, I guess, informed by maybe a Cold War idea that this was a text that was going to teach you something about Soviet power. It's going to teach you about the Soviet injustices against Kazakh people, for example. And this idea that works of literature from peripheries of Russian or Soviet empires are useful only in the sense that they provide ethnographic information or they teach us something about Russian power, how Russian power works, are on the one hand really, I mean, they have been extraordinarily interesting and useful and valid, but also they have tended to sidestep what is actually going on in the texts. And what is it the authors were expressing, and how can we interpret what it is that the authors were expressing? And one book that I think, I actually have it right here, that has done just an excellent job in, again, upending those expectations is Leah Feldman's On the Threshold of Eurasia, which looks at the South Caucasus as a contact zone and theorizes on and draws from a lot of different theoretical perspectives in order to examine what it is this literature at the crux of three empires was doing as these empires were falling apart. Another recent edited volume that came out that I think I've learned a lot from anyway, is an edited volume by Kevin Platt, Global Russian Cultures, which looks at Russophone or Russian language literature from a lot of different places in the world, from former Soviet republics to the United States and Israel, and incorporates discussion of film as well as literature. And so I think above all, we're coming back to Bruce's initial comment about centering what we once thought was peripheral. And in this case, I think it's the texts themselves that are finally getting their due.
What a great concluding point there, Naomi. There's a lot to be excited about in our field, as you both helped us understand, including, of course, your own work. Bruce Grant, Naomi Caffey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for
having us.
You were great
for
this.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.